couple years ago, I had a series of panic attacks, and that completely changed my perspective of vulnerability. And it turned out that I was having these panic attacks because I had committed to writing a book about vulnerability when I myself did not believe in vulnerability. So that's kind of the personal journey that I had. On the business side, over the past few years, even in my previous book, The Future Leader, which came out in 2020, as I was interviewing a lot of executives, specifically CEOs of companies around the world, I would hear the theme of vulnerability and emotional intelligence come up a lot. But at the same time, these CEOs told me that they were faced with two very specific challenges. The first challenge is that a lot of these executives, a lot of these CEOs acknowledged that while vulnerability is important and powerful in their personal lives, for example, with their friends, their family members, their spouse, their significant other, very important to be vulnerable with those types of people, it was very different at work. And that's because inside of your organization, it's a very different dynamic. Because at work, you have a boss, you have leaders, you have a hierarchy, you have projects, you have deadlines, you have customers, you're being paid a salary to do work. It's just a very different dynamic at work versus in your personal life. The second thing that a lot of these leaders were telling me is that they were very confused by the message they were getting from their employees. Because on the one hand, employees were saying, well, we want you to be strong and competent and visionary. We want to know that you always have a plan, that you can, figure out the next path forward for the company, that you can figure out how to get us out of a tough spot. But at the same time, these employees were saying, we also want you to talk about your challenges and your weaknesses and your struggles. And a lot of these executives were saying, wait a minute, what kind of a leader am I supposed to be? Am I supposed to be the strong, competent, confident leader? Or am I supposed to be someone who's very comfortable talking about my challenges and weaknesses and struggles? And so I thought it was a very interesting time to write a book specifically about vulnerability at work for leaders. Because one of the things that I realized is that vulnerability for leaders is not the same as it is for everybody else. I don't advocate for being vulnerable at work. I know that sounds a little bit crazy. I don't advocate for being vulnerable at work. Instead, I'm a big believer in leading with vulnerability. What's the difference? Now, to illustrate that difference, I want to share two stories for you. The first is a story that comes from Hollis Harris. He's the former CEO of Continental Airlines. Now, when Hollis Harris was the CEO of Continental Airlines, the company was going through a tough time. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, Hollis Harris was asked to write a memo to his entire workforce of around 30,000 plus employees to talk about what was going on in the business. And so he sends out this memo to his workforce, and he talks about the challenges and the struggles, the macroeconomic factors, and he addressed all the difficulties that the business was going through. But he didn't end up providing any kind of solutions or ideas or path forward. In fact, he ended that memo by saying that the best thing that employees could do is to pray for the future of the business. Now imagine that. You're an employee working for Hollis Harris. You've just been given this message, and at the end it says, pray for the future of our company. Did you know that 96% of the people who watch videos on this channel are not subscribed? That's pretty crazy, right? Make sure that you hit subscribe to the YouTube channel so you can get notified when more videos just like this one are released. The next day, Hollis Harris was fired. Now, I contrast this to a story about Fleetwood Grobler. He's the CEO of a South African energy company called Sasol. When he took over as CEO, the company was near bankruptcy. It was $13 billion in debt. And he too was asked to give a town hall, an all-hands meeting, and to address his workforce. And his message was a little bit similar but different. And he started off his message also acknowledging the challenges and the problems, talking about how the company was going through a tough time, that there were a lot of struggles, that he wasn't sure what the future of the business was going to look like. But he also said that he had a vision and a path forward. He believed that if employees could come together, that they could rebuild trust in the eyes of their customers and in their employees. And he told his workforce, he said, if you come with me on this journey and help me figure out that path forward, then I'm sure that we will be able to turn this business around and become successful. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. Now, what Hollis Harris did was vulnerable. What Fleetwood Grobler did was lead with vulnerability. So let me give you a couple more examples of the difference between those. One of the classic examples of vulnerability is being able to admit to a mistake. Now, it's of course important to have that psychological safety where you feel like you can admit to a mistake. But just because you have that psychological safety to be able to do that doesn't mean that there isn't a right and a wrong way to approach it. So being vulnerable would mean that, let's say your boss gives you a project and you mess it up. And you go to your boss and you say, I am so sorry. I know how important this project was, but I really messed it up. That's vulnerability. Now, you have to imagine that your leader, he's not going to look at you, or she's not going to look at you and say, oh, thank you so much for telling me about this mistake, right? Your leader's going to say, okay, now what? What's the solution? The customer is still unhappy. The product is still not completed. We still didn't meet our deadline. We still didn't meet our revenue goals. In other words, yeah, it's great that you feel safe to talk about the fact that you made a mistake, but in the eyes of your leader, in the eyes of your team, they want to know what now? What are you going to do about the mistake that you made? So leading with vulnerability in that situation would be, I'm really sorry I made this mistake. Here are 3 things, or here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. And here are 3 things that I'm going to do going forward to make sure that that mistake never happens again. That's a big difference between vulnerability versus leading with vulnerability. In other words, vulnerability in the context of work is really about exposing a gap that you have, a gap in competence, a gap in experience, knowledge, emotion, whatever it might be. But you're basically saying, I have a gap in this area. Leading with vulnerability is, hey, I have a gap in this area. Here's what I'm trying to do to fix it. Here's what I'm trying to do to close the gap. Here's what I'm trying to do to get better, to learn, to grow. And that is a very important distinction to make it work. Nobody just wants to hear about the gaps that you have. People want to know what you're doing to try to solve that problem, to get better, to learn, and to grow. So the way that I define a vulnerable leader is a leader who intentionally opens themselves up to the potential of emotional harm. That's vulnerability. But while taking action to create a positive outcome. That's leadership. And so the big message from everything that I'm going to talk about today is, what is the action that you can take to create that positive outcome? Whenever you are faced with vulnerability, ask yourself, how can you add leadership into the mix? How can you add competence? How can you demonstrate that you're trying to close that gap in any situation where vulnerability is present? And if there's one thing that I hope that you remember from anything that I talk about today, it's this concept of the vulnerable leader equation. And this is a very simple visual for how you can think of leading with vulnerability. And that is vulnerability plus leadership equals leading with vulnerability. Competence plus connection. Connection is the vulnerability. Competence is the leadership. These are the 2 most important aspects, the 2 most important roles that any leader has: to connect with your people and to demonstrate that competence, to be good at your job. If you can do those 2 things, I think the sky's the limit. Now, the problem is that oftentimes we focus on either one or we focus on the other, but we really need to be focusing on both. Now, I did a survey with DDI, and we asked a lot of employees and a lot of leaders around the most frequent leadership behaviors that successful leaders do, that they practice. Some of the most successful behaviors that leaders do most frequently are things like maintaining high trust and confidentiality, sharing your thoughts and your rationale for a decision. These are very common things that leaders are known for. These are very common leadership attributes. But if you look at the very bottom of this chart, you're going to see things like showing a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable, genuinely acknowledging failures or shortcomings, inquiring and caring about my well-being. These are things that leaders are most uncomfortable with. These are things that leaders are not doing nearly as often as they should. And I kind of categorize this as emerging versus traditional leadership behaviors. The traditional ones are kind of like what we talked about, being able to share your rationale for a decision, being able to maintain high trust and confidentiality. Those are very traditional leadership attributes. But the emerging leadership attributes are things like the being able to show vulnerability, inquiring about well-being, talking about failures, challenges, and weaknesses. And what we found when we looked at this data is that the more senior you become inside of an organization, the less likely you are to practice these emerging leadership behaviors. Again, the more senior you become inside of a company, the less likely you are to practice these emerging leadership behaviors. When we specifically look at showing a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable, we find that the more senior you become, the less likely you are to show a willingness to be emotionally vulnerable. And you see a really big drop when you go from mid-level leadership to senior level leadership. It's just a huge drop. So it goes to show that senior leaders really struggle with this concept.